I stand on business, you know. Why would you ever allow someone to play with me in that manner? Why are you allowing someone to play with me in that way? The world was told by King Harris that he was standing on business. But reality broke the moment those prison doors closed. The truth about what actually transpired inside has recently been revealed by a gang leader. And it's not at all like the bold persona he developed on the internet. We learn tonight why the so-called Prince of Trap is afraid of being imprisoned. The appearance of being on business. King Harris believed he would be protected from the harsh reality of the streets by his family name, his fancy automobiles, his renown, and his musical heritage. However, the reality struck him more forcefully than anyone anticipated. One gang leader from Atlanta has recently come up to say that the so-called Prince of Trap isn't suited for the life he's been pursuing. And for someone who has spent years yelling about standing on business, the reason he is reportedly afraid behind bars is not only startling, but also extremely degrading. This isn't another tale of a famous child going crazy. The nasty collision between privilege and street politics is exposed in this full-fledged cautionary tale. The most startling aspect of this exposé, which you will hear before we finish, is the reason why a particular gang member publicly degraded King in such a vicious and scathing manner that other prisoners began to chuckle rather than tremble when they heard his name. Let's go back in time to the sequence of events that brought us to this point before we reveal that shocking revelation. Without a doubt, the picture King Harris wants the world to see is not what you are going to witness. The notorious traffic stop should be our first topic. It appeared to be routine at first glance. A young man turning illegally in a BMW. But in a matter of seconds, that straightforward action turned into a nightmare. Officers discovered there was more to the incident than a negligent driving error. A warrant was in place. Weapons were present. The son of Atlanta royalty was abruptly thrust into the harsh realities of police work. Suddenly, the fantasy broke down. This was not aggressive rhetoric on Instagram or the swagger of a music video. This was his wrist being locked in chilly steel cuffs. Officers warned him to keep his hands still or else the car will smell like marijuana. This is when the interesting part begins. King remained composed. Contrary to popular belief, he did not become angry. On the surface, at least, he played it cool. The police even admitted it. You're being held now that you've received advice. All right? You seem like a cool kid, but do anything else but what I'm telling you. However, maintaining composure during a pause is one thing. It's a quite different matter to confront the prison hierarchy. And here is precisely where the gang leader's disclosure breaks the illusion. As King's attempt to portray himself as a genuine individual seeking respect was shattered, the instant rumors started to circulate about his true handling of the situation in custody. Let's take a moment to consider why King's preoccupation with this street identity is so perplexing in the first place before we disclose that humiliation. Not even pundits who typically support up-and-coming rappers could understand it. He presented it to the world in an unvarnished manner. I'm constantly perplexed as to why King feels the need, urge, and desire to be viewed as a street person. For example, why is he so fixated on this and the hardships of being a street guy? It's not like street guys are winning. Consider that. Born into affluence, the son of a multimillionaire, he is obsessed with showing that he belongs to a life that most people would do anything to avoid. The public outbursts followed, the moments that demonstrated the true fragility of this image. Recall the fight with T, his own father. Every word was captured by the cameras, and the result was blatant insecurity cloaked in defiance. I stand on business, as you are aware. Why would you ever allow someone to play with me in that manner? Why are you allowing someone to play with me in that way? King repeatedly yelled about standing on business. However, to his father and the millions of people who watched, it appeared more like a child frantically attempting to demonstrate that he wasn't weak than a man demanding respect. And this is the main reason why the gang leader's remarks were so powerful, ladies and gentlemen. Instagram Live is not available inside jail walls. No viral video exists to skew the story. Only survival and unadulterated reputation remain. Additionally, King's last name was more significant than his name when he entered. Insiders said that the terror was written all over him as the murmurs began. This is where we establish the scene for the following section. An Atlanta street person who had no connection to the Harris family came forward with information regarding King supposedly losing it when he was questioned. It spread like wildfire among those who had been following this tale unfold since the description was so graphic and degrading. Worst of all, it wasn't simply the prisoners who were laughing. Outside, there was the streets as well, because King's infatuation with Crash Out appeared to them more like cosplay than bravery. And the fantasy totally fell apart when that gang leader's statement served as a reality check. Hold on tight, because we'll be delving further into what was said, how it spread, and why King Harris is now balancing shame and direct danger inside those walls in the next segment. The majority of people are unaware of this aspect of jail politics. It has nothing to do with your outward wealth. It has nothing to do with your Instagram following, and it certainly has nothing to do with your parents. The way you present yourself as soon as you enter those chilly, fluorescent-lit chambers is all that matters. And King Harris made a mistake there. The mask came off almost instantly. He appeared less like the strong person who had been bravado on social media, and more like a young man who had found that his father's notoriety couldn't buy him respect, according to those familiar with the admissions process. When you contrast this with his public speech, it becomes even more terrible. He has consistently presented himself as a courageous, unflappable individual who was born to be respected. However, Tiny, his own mother, broke that perception with a casual remark that said it all. Why? I'm aware that King has changed for other reasons and lacks common sense. Do you see what I mean? Doesn't ask us a question? You understand what I mean when I say that everyone knows King doesn't have? He isn't completely insane. His mother is speaking there. Nor a blogger, nor a critic. He was called out by his own mother. And when you put that alongside his father's exasperation, T literally telling him, "You wanted to go over there. You cried and cried and cried when you couldn't go over there. We got big house, big yard, nothing to do. But you want to be from the ghetto so bad." You begin to see the picture. King Harris wasn't raised in the trenches. He chased them. He wanted that validation so badly he tried to manufacture it. And here's the cruel irony. Real street dudes don't respect that. In fact, they smell it from a mile away. They know the difference between someone who was forced into survival and someone who chose danger because they thought it looked cool. This is why, when the gang leader spoke out about King, people listened because he wasn't just clowning. He was exposing something many already suspected, that King's stand-on-business persona collapses when there's no camera rolling. But let's zoom out for a moment. Why does this matter so much? Why does the downfall of a celebrity's son capture so much attention? It's because of the hypocrisy. For years, T.I. has positioned himself as both a reformed hustler and a moral compass for the culture. He talks about growth, about avoiding the pitfalls of the streets. Yet, here's his son, not only running headfirst into those very traps, but doing it with a smugness that mocks the lessons his father claims to stand for. This is the same T.I. who famously told young men to expeditiously take accountability for their choices. Yet, when his own bloodline spiraled, the image cracked. And instead of a united front, what did the public see? A father and son shouting at each other on Instagram Live with King screaming, "Why you letting somebody play with me like that?" While T stood there looking tired. For the streets, it was comedy. For the family, it was humiliation. For King himself, it was a preview of what was to come. Because in prison, there's always somebody ready to play with you. Always someone testing you, seeing if the talk matches the walk. And when the gang leader revealed how King allegedly responded to those first tests, the internet lit up. Not because they were surprised, but because it confirmed what they already believe. But let's not skip ahead just yet. We need to address the culture that enabled this. Platforms and bloggers have in many ways fed King's delusions. Take academics, for example. He turned King's petty arrests into full-blown storylines, half mocking, half egging him on. At one point, he even joked about what King needed to do to be considered a real gangster. Like, "What's up? Yo, King got to drop a body or something, bro." Now, obviously, he's joking. But think about the effect. When millions of viewers are laughing, when clips go viral of people saying you're not a real one unless you escalate, it plants a dangerous seed. And for someone like King, Desperate to prove himself, those words aren't just jokes. They're validation. So he doubles down. He lashes out at his father. He declares himself a man who stands on business. He walks around Atlanta puffing out his chest. But the moment that cell door slammed, all that energy evaporated. And this is why the gang leader's words cut so deep, because they stripped away the last layer of that facade. According to him, King wasn't feared. He wasn't respected. He was scared. And in the cutthroat environment of prison, fear is blood in the water. Now, here's the piece that hasn't been talked about enough. The psychological toll of that humiliation. When you spend years trying to convince the world you're a lion, but the first time you step into the jungle, you freeze. That doesn't just bruise your ego. It destroys your credibility. And for King Harris, credibility was the only currency he had left. But we're just scratching the surface here. Because in the next part, we're going to break down exactly what this gang leader said, how it spread through both the prison and the streets, and why it has permanently changed the way people look at King Harris. Because if part 1 is about the build-up, the car stop, the family drama, the online hype, then part 2 is the detonation. The moment the illusion fully collapsed and the streets got their confirmation that King Harris isn't who he says he is. And once we go there, the question becomes, can King ever recover? Or is he doomed to live in the shadow of a reputation that was exposed before it even began? Brutal revelation. The first thing you need to understand is this. In prison, gossip spreads faster than contraband. One whispered story in intake can become a full-blown legend by lunchtime. And when the gang leader decided to speak up about King Harris, he didn't just share a few offhand remarks. He painted a picture so vivid, so humiliating that even people who once defended King stopped trying. Now, here's what insiders say went down. When King first stepped into custody, he was walking with the arrogance of someone who believed his last name would protect him. He wasn't shackled in fear, at least not yet. But according to this gang leader, that confidence didn't survive the first confrontation. The claim that King was tested almost immediately. A small shove in the hallway. A question barked in his face. You standing on business, right? Let's see it then. And instead of pushing back, instead of holding his ground, the gang leader says, King froze. That freeze was all it took because once the inmate smelled hesitation, the story spread like wildfire. The self-proclaimed tough guy was scared. Think about the irony. On the outside, King Harris was screaming to his father, I start business. Why you even letting somebody play with me like that? Why you letting somebody play with me like that? Why you let him play with me? Yet on the inside, when real business was put in front of him, he couldn't deliver. And here's where the gang leader's account gets brutal. He didn't just say King froze. He claimed King tried to talk his way out of it, that he dropped names, that he reminded people who his father was. Let that sink in. The one thing you can't do in jail is lean on privilege. You can't name drop your way into respect. All it does is confirm you don't have your own. And once that image of fear took root, it spread. By dinner, King wasn't T's son. He was the punchline. Guys were mocking him, imitating him, replaying the moment he allegedly stuttered under pressure. That's why this gang leader's revelation was so devastating. Because it wasn't about paperwork or charges or whether King had money for commissary. It was about heart. And according to the man who saw it firsthand, King Harris had none when it mattered. Now, here's where the story gets even darker. Because humiliation doesn't just bruise pride inside prison. It creates danger. The moment the story spread that King was scared, he became a target. Not necessarily for violence right away, but for manipulation, guys. Has started plotting how to test him again, how to use his fear against him. And if you think this is exaggerated, look at the pattern. Plenty of rappers, kids, or celebrity offspring have tried to prove themselves in tough environments. 9 times out of 10, it ends the same way. Exposure. That confusion academics voiced, it's the same confusion the streets feel now. Except in jail, confusion turns to ridicule. And the ridicule didn't stay inside those walls. It leaked out through whispers, through calls, through the grapevine that connects the prison yard to the outside world. By the time the gang leader made his comments public, people were already buzzing with the story. King Harris was not built for the life he claimed. The fallout was immediate. Blogs picked it up. Social media ran with it. Memes flooded timelines. And the cruelest twist of all, fans began resurfacing old clips of King shouting at his father or rapping about standing on business and overlaying them with jokes about his alleged breakdown in jail. The very words King used to prop himself up became weapons against him. Now, some of you might be wondering, why would a gang leader even expose this? Why would someone inside break the code and publicly clown a young man like that? The answer is simple: credibility. For that gang leader, exposing King wasn't just about humiliating a celebrity's son. It was about reminding people that the streets don't bend for fame, that money, fame, or family ties don't erase the rules. By calling King out, he elevated his own reputation. He made it clear he was the man who checked Ty's son. And in that twisted world, that's power. Now, let's talk about the psychological fallout for King. Imagine being 20 years old, already struggling to prove yourself, already under the microscope of fame, and then having your weakest moment broadcast to the world. How do you recover from that? You don't, at least not easily, because every move you make after that is filtered through the lens of humiliation. If King lashes out again online, people will say, "That's just him overcompensating." If he tries to act tough in music videos, people will laugh, remembering the gang leader's words. And here's the killer. Even if King did toughen up in jail later, even if he did stand his ground in a different situation, nobody's going to remember that. The only thing people will remember is the first story, the one that painted him as scared. That's how reputations work. First impressions stick, especially when they're negative. And so, in many ways, King Harris's fate was sealed the moment that gang leader spoke. But it doesn't end there. Because what makes this revelation even more devastating is how it lines up with everything we've already seen from King's family. His father calling him out for chasing the ghetto life. His mother saying he ain't got good sense. His own public meltdowns where he screamed about respect but looked desperate. All of it culminates in the gang leader's assessment. It doesn't feel like a random insult. It feels like confirmation, and that's why the streets are taking it seriously. So, where does this leave King Harris? Is he forever trapped in the role of a clown, mocked both inside and out? Or does he have one last chance to rewrite the narrative? The fallout and the end of credibility. The smoke had barely cleared from the gang leader revelation before the outside world erupted. What started as a whispered humiliation inside a cell block spread across Atlanta like wildfire. By the time it hit social media, it wasn't just a rumor, it was a punchline. Memes started pouring in. Clips of King yelling at his father were stitched alongside jokes about him freezing up in jail. His old declarations about standing on business were replayed with sarcastic captions. Business closed early, and perhaps the cruelest edit of all, a side-by-side video of King shouting, "You know, I stand on business," paired with a laughing track and text that read, "But not in prison." The internet is ruthless, but in this case, the ridicule hit harder because it felt like confirmation. People already doubted King's toughness. They already rolled their eyes at his obsession with the streets. The gang leader's story was simply the missing puzzle piece. And while the internet was laughing, King's family was being dragged into the storm too. His father, T, found himself in an impossible position. For years, he's juggled the role of rap legend, community leader, and family man. He's preached about responsibility and growth. Yet here was his own son becoming the poster child for everything he warned against. Worse, the family's private tensions were already public. The altercations, the arguments, the shouting matches, all of it was out there for the world to dissect. So when the gang leader claim hit the streets, it didn't just make King look bad. It made T.I. look powerless. The image of the patriarch who couldn't control his son's spiral was just as damaging as the image of King himself breaking under pressure. And then there was Tiny, King's mother, whose comments about him not having good sense resurfaced in the ugliest ways possible. Fans dug them up, plastered them next to the gang leader revelation, and declared even his mama knew. This wasn't just a family dealing with internal drama anymore. It was a full-blown public spectacle. But the most brutal part of the fallout, it wasn't just about humiliation. It was about safety. Because once the story spread that King was scared, the stakes inside prison shifted. No matter how rich his family is, no matter how many lawyers T.I. can hire, the reality is simple. If you're seen as weak in jail, you become prey. It doesn't always mean violence. Sometimes it's manipulation. Sometimes it's being forced to run errands or hand over commissary. Sometimes it's psychological torment. But whatever form it takes, it's dangerous. That's the knife's edge King now walks on. His reputation, once inflated by bravado, is now a liability. And here's the kicker. The streets don't forget. Even if King is released tomorrow, even if he goes back to living in luxury, the stain of this revelation will follow him. In Atlanta's culture, where credibility is everything, being labeled as scared in prison is a scar that doesn't heal. And the ripple effects stretch beyond King himself. It affects his father's image. It affects the family brand. It even affects how people view celebrity kids in general. Because King isn't the first to chase street credibility he didn't need, and he won't be the last. But his downfall is one of the most public, one of the most embarrassing, and one of the most preventable. Now, let's zoom out. What does this mean in the bigger picture? It's a reminder of a disturbing pattern, the glorification of struggle by those who never had to live it. Young men born into wealth idolizing pain they never endured. Kids with chauffeurs pretending to be from the block. It's cosplay, but the consequences are real. And when the act collides with reality, as it did for King Harris, the results are devastating. Even academics in one of his many rants called this out with cruel honesty. He mocked King for treating a petty arrest like a badge of honor, saying it was laughable for someone born with so much privilege to act like he was hardened by the streets. His words weren't just commentary. They were prophecy because that same obsession with proving himself led King straight into the situation where the gang leader exposed him. So, where does this leave King now? On one hand, he could lean into the humiliation, admit he was never built for the life he chased, and pivot. He could use this moment as a turning point, dropping the act and embracing the privileges he was born with. But does anyone really believe he'll do that? Because if there's one thing we've seen, it's that King Harris doesn't like to back down. Even when embarrassed, even when corrected by his parents on livestream, even when the internet is mocking him, his instinct is to double down, to yell louder, to insist he's standing on business, even when everyone knows otherwise. And that's what makes this story so tragic. The more he fights to prove himself, the deeper he digs his own hole. The gang leader's revelation didn't just humiliate him in the moment. It locked him into a cycle he may never escape. Because from now on, every choice King makes will be seen through this lens. Is he overcompensating for being exposed? Is he trying too hard to erase the memory of freezing up for someone obsessed with respect? That's a prison far worse than the one he's physically in. So, let's end with the question that matters most. Is redemption possible? For some, yes, we've seen people recover from humiliations, rebuild their images, even rebrand themselves entirely. But for King Harris, the challenge is steeper because his humiliation wasn't random. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the exact opposite of the image he built his identity around. And that's the cruelest twist of all. King Harris didn't just lose credibility. He lost the very thing he built his persona on. And in the world of hip-hop, in the streets of Atlanta, in the eyes of the internet, that's a debt you can't easily pay back. So, as the dust settles, one truth remains. The gang leader's words didn't just expose King Harris. They defined him. And unless he finds a way to rewrite the story, he'll forever be remembered not as the Prince of Trap, but as the kid who stood on business until the business stood on him.